Welcome, dear traveler. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first time, welcome to this quiet corner where forgotten history lingers. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight and what time is it there? Feel free to leave a comment. It's always a comfort to see where our fellow night wanderers gather. And if you enjoy these soft, shadowed journeys through time, consider subscribing, so you'll never miss the next one. Now, let's begin. The stones of Paris sweltered beneath an unrelenting sun. It was a season when the city breathed shallowly, its narrow arteries choked with heat. The tall facades leaned inward over cramped streets, trapping the air, thick and motionless. Above, the sky was a pale, searing expanse. No cloud dared linger there. Along the river, the Seine moved sluggishly, its waters dark and low. Wooden barges sat still against the banks, ropes slack, while the towers of Notre Dame shimmered faintly through the haze. For merchants, the market at Place de Grève struggled under brutal sun. Baskets of herbs wilted before midday. Fishmongers fanned themselves with weary hands as their salted stock shriveled. The sharp tang of vinegar and sweat hung in the air. Coins were exchanged in slow, deliberate motions, the metal warm to the touch. For scribes, in stone chambers beneath the Hôtel de Ville, the coolness of shaded walls provided fleeting relief. There, beneath worn banners and thick beams, quills scratched across parchment in soft rhythm. Inkpots sat heavy with clotted ink. The air was scented with wax and dust. A single candle guttered beside a folded letter left untouched. Beyond, the streets gleamed under the sun's gaze. Dogs lay motionless in doorways, ribs rising faintly with each breath. At the city's wells, women in faded linen lowered buckets slowly, listening to the rope creak as cool water rose from unseen depths. For peasants, in fields beyond the walls, earth lay cracked and dry. Scythes moved wearily through brittle stalks. Sweat traced slow paths down sunburned skin. In kitchens, fires were kept low, bread baked hard and fast to spare the heat. In shaded corners, old women whispered prayers for rain. Inside stone chapels, candles burned dim against the heat. Velvet-draped altars seemed to absorb the warmth, and the faint scent of incense clung to the shadows. A priest's voice echoed softly beneath vaulted stone, each word hanging thick in the stifling air. In the great cloister gardens, leaves hung limp. Fountains stood still, their basins ringed with lime. There, a lone figure moved slowly between columns, linen pressed against skin, breath shallow, fingers trailing along cool stone. For women, the heat was a constant, patient adversary. Water was drawn again and again, each trip slower than the last. Linens were soaked and hung across open windows, stirring faintly in whatever breeze might find them. Salt spilled across worn tables, brushed away in languid motions. And as dusk crept in, the warmth lingered, heavy in stone and breath alike. Behind shuttered windows, nobles reclined on linen sheets shaded by thick velvet. Perfumed waters were poured into silver basins, their coolness fading too soon beneath the night's weight. And across the cold beams, shadows gathered in silence. The city of Paris did not sleep easily in the summer heat. As dawn approached, the pale light of morning seeped between tall chimneys and slate-tiled rooftops. The narrow alleys below lay cloaked in last night's warmth, stone and timber exhaling slowly into the gray hour. Shutters creaked open by cautious hands. Dust motes stirred in slender shafts of light, drifting across wooden beams. Somewhere a bell tolled the first call of the day, its sound thin and distant beneath the weight of the air. At the market stalls, baskets of fruit were arranged with slow, deliberate motions. Figs, overripe beneath bruised skins, leaked sweet, sticky trails onto warped boards. Apples dulled in the haze. Bunches of wilted herbs were tied with fraying twine, their scent sharp in the early light. For soldiers. The guard at the Petit Châtelet moved with weary precision. Leather straps tugged against sweat-slicked skin. Iron buckles burned hot beneath gloved fingers. In the courtyard, swords hung heavy at their sides as the city gates creaked open, letting in a sluggish trickle of traders and townsfolk. For scribes. Within the dim confines of a monastery's scriptorium, cool air lingered a moment longer. Robes whispered across flagstone floors. A lone figure bent over a thick manuscript, fingers tracing faded ink. A candle guttered beside him, its wax pooling slowly, pale against dark oak. Outside, the sun rose with quiet cruelty. Shadows shrank to thin lines against stone. The river's surface shimmered like molten glass. Boats drifted, their oars dipping with labored strokes. For peasants, carts rattled along uneven streets, their wooden wheels leaving faint trails in the dust. Barrels of salted fish, cloth bundles, and rough-hewn timbers were hauled beneath strained backs. The air smelled of brine, earth, and sweat. In workshops, smiths stirred sluggish embers, coaxing reluctant flames. The ring of hammer on iron was slow, measured. Sparks flared and faded, swallowed by the heavy air. For women, water was drawn in endless ritual. At the courtyard well, linen-covered figures queued in silence, their faces shaded beneath broad straw hats. Wooden buckets rose dripping from the depths, water glistening briefly before being lost to thirst and sun. Salt-stained floors were swept with languid strokes. Folds of cloth were wrung out and laid across windows, fluttering faintly in a hope of coolness. In the grand houses of the Ile de la Cité, velvet curtains were drawn tight. Servants moved barefoot across tiled floors, bearing trays of chilled wine and damp cloths. Glass carafes fogged with condensation, precious coolness fading with each breath of the room. For merchants, beneath stone arcades, ledgers were marked with slow care. Quills dragged through thick ink. A single droplet of sweat traced the length of a merchant's wrist, pausing at the cuff before falling to stain the parchment below. Beyond the market square, the streets grew quieter. Dogs lay sprawled in thin bands of shade. Cats lingered atop sun-warmed walls, their tails flicking in drowsy rhythm. For scribes, a folded letter was placed upon a stone table, its wax seal soft beneath the warmth. Beside it, a single candle burned low, its pool of light trembling in the still air. Footsteps echoed through empty cloisters. The rustle of linen robes mingled with the distant murmur of prayer. Within the shadows, a solitary figure knelt beneath worn stone, breath slow, eyes closed. And as the hour deepened toward midday, the city seemed to hold its breath once more. The sun hung motionless above the rooftops, its heat pressing down through slate and timber. Shutters rattled faintly, iron hinges groaned in the silence, and through forgotten corridors, soft footsteps echoed. Beneath the unblinking eye of the sun, Paris folded in upon itself. By midday, the narrow streets shimmered beneath waves of rising heat. Cobblestones, bleached pale, burned beneath bare feet. Even the shadows, once a refuge, grew thin and restless beneath the stone facades. The bells of Saint-Jacques struck the hour, each toll languid, swallowed by the dense air. For merchants, awnings sagged beneath their own weight, canvas edges fluttering weakly. Beneath them, traders moved in slow, deliberate motions. Cloth was unrolled and gathered again, bolts of faded linen growing heavy beneath the touch. Coins clinked softly, each exchange punctuated by the low murmur of wearied voices. For scribes, the cool depths of the Palais de la Cité offered brief sanctuary. Within vaulted halls, light filtered through narrow windows, thin as a blade. Candles burned low in iron sconces, their smoke rising in slow spirals. A clerk bent over a ledger, fingers stained with ink. A droplet of sweat traced the curve of his brow, falling with a faint sound upon the parchment. He paused, quill held aloft, and for a moment the chamber was utterly still. For peasants, the outer districts lay veiled in dust. Carts stood abandoned beneath lean-to shelters, oxen swayed, heads low, eyes half-lidded. Children played in silent groups beneath stone arches, their laughter muted, steps slow across the sun-warmed earth. At the well near Rue des Barres, the line of women lengthened through the hour. Clay pitchers stood in rows, their surfaces cool to the touch. Each bucket drawn rose with aching slowness, water glinting like molten silver before vanishing into the depths of thirsty vessels. For soldiers, the guard at the Grand Châtelet shifted in weary rhythm. Mailles coiffes weighed heavy upon their shoulders. Helms gleamed dully in the heat. Along the battlements the river glistened, a wide band of light offering no relief. Within the kitchens of the Hôtel Dieu the fires lay banked and low. Cooks moved with practiced care. Ladles scraped against worn cauldrons. The scent of stewed herbs hung in the air, mingled with the faint copper tang of old blood. For women, in dim upper rooms, linens were pressed against bare skin. Fingers traced the cool edges of pewter basins. Faint draughts stirred damp cloths strung across narrow windows, their edges fluttering like slow breath. A comb moved through dark hair, each stroke languid, deliberate. In the half-light, a single pearl rolled across a stone table, its path slow, unhurried. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Notre Dame, silence reigned. Candles flickered before dark altars, their light wavered across carved stone. A solitary figure knelt in the nave, breath slow, eyes lowered. The faint rustle of cloth echoed through the empty space. For merchants, ledgers lay open upon wooden desks, ink pooling beneath heavy lines. Seals were pressed into warm wax, their edges softened by the heat. A folded letter was laid carefully beneath a weight of stone, its message meant for a cooler hour. In the cloisters of the Jacobins, the garden lay hushed beneath the sun. Leaves hung limp along the colonnades. Fountains stood still. A novice traced patterns in the dust with the tip of his sandal, each line fading beneath his breath. And as the hour lengthened toward afternoon, the city seemed to pulse in slow rhythm. The clang of distant bells blurred beneath the heat. Voices softened, gestures slowed. Beneath faded banners, a knight's gauntlet rested upon worn wood. In the courtyard beyond, the shadow of a standard shifted across cracked stone, and through unseen cracks, salt whispered faintly still. Beyond the heavy stones of the city walls, the fields shimmered beneath an unbroken sky. Paris held its breath through the heat of the afternoon. The rhythm of life slowed to a soft, near-silent pulse. Across the city's winding heart, figures moved like shadows, measured, deliberate. In the alleys near the Rue Saint-Antoine, the cobbles radiated warmth beneath each step. Curtains hung limp across narrow windows. Dogs dozed in thin bands of shade. At the cloth market, bolts of faded wool lay untouched beneath sagging canopies. A merchant wiped the back of his neck with a frayed kerchief, eyes half closed against the glare. Nearby, a faded awning flapped once, then stilled. For scribes, within a stone chamber overlooking the cloister garden, a lone figure bent once more to his work. Parchment crackled beneath careful fingers. The tip of his quill traced slow arcs across faded vellum. A faint breeze stirred through the high windows, carrying the distant scent of sun-warmed stone. The scribe paused, eyes drawn to a single candle burning low, its wick leaning toward the draught, flame flickering uncertainly. For women, The inner courtyards offered slight refuge. Water drawn from deep wells cooled basin and skin alike. Linen shifts clung damp against weary bodies. Across shaded stones whispers passed between those gathered, words slow and spare as though sound itself were too heavy to carry. A folded letter lay beneath a smooth river stone sealed earlier that morning, its contents pressed in silence against the page, awaiting hands not yet returned. For merchants. The counting rooms behind shuttered storefronts breathed stale air. Ledgers lay open in dappled light, columns of figures smudged by restless fingers. The slow scrape of a chair echoed softly. Nearby, a droplet of sweat darkened the corner of a page. Beyond the markets, the winding lanes of the Quartier Latin lay hushed beneath the weight of the sun. Faint strains of lute and voice drifted from a shaded tavern, notes blurred by the heat. For peasants, the outer fields shimmered beneath the midday glare. Bent figures moved among rows of brittle stalks. Scythes swung in slow arcs, blades flashing once, then sinking again into dry stems. A child gathered stray grains in a woven basket, feet dusted pale with earth. In the distance, a dog barked once, sharp, solitary, before the silence folded in once more. For soldiers. The guard at the Porte Saint-Denis shifted beneath sun-scorched mail. Leather straps creaked with each breath. Fingers tapped idly against worn hilts. A flag stirred above the gate, edges frayed by wind and time, now hanging still. In the cool chapels of the abbey, a solitary priest traced a slow circle across the worn stone floor. A single strand of incense smoke wound upward, twining through shafts of muted light. For a pilgrim. A woman knelt at the threshold of Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, her palms pressed to the cool stone. Beside her, a bundle of faded cloth rested upon the floor. A coin gleamed faintly where it had fallen from her hand, resting at the edge of a shadow. Her breath moved in slow rhythm. Around her, the great silence of the place seemed to gather, folding over her shoulders like a worn cloak. Through it all, the city held to its rhythm, measured, patient, heavy with the long hours of summer. A single cart creaked along the Rue de la Verrerie, its wheels tracing pale tracks in the dust. The driver dozed against the reins, the horse moved with slow, steady steps, and beneath worn velvet the keys sang faintly once more. As the sun began its slow descent, the breath of the city deepened. Shadows lengthened beneath worn lintels and crooked beams. The heat did not vanish. It shifted, pressed inward into stone and timber. Air moved sluggishly through the narrow streets, thick with the scent of dust and river and sweat. In the alleys near Rue des Blancs-Manteaux, laundry hung limp upon sagging lines. Each thread stretched beneath the weight of damp linen, droplets falling in languid rhythm to the cobbles below. A lone bell sounded from the tower of Saint-Gervais, its tone soft, hollow, wrapped in the hush of the hour. For merchants, shutters groaned closed with weary hands. Ledgers were stacked beneath smooth stones, seals pressed into cooling wax. Beneath faded banners, figures gathered in darkened alcoves. Voices low, wine poured in slow streams into earthen cups. For scribes, the pages of a half-finished chronicle lay across a worn desk. Ink glistened faintly where the quill had paused. The scribe's eyes traced unseen lines upon the wall beyond, breath shallow beneath the heat-stained air. And for women, in the dim upper rooms of a stone house near the cloister wall, Leonard moved slowly through the hush. Her fingers traced the curve of a brass basin, lifting cool water to her brow. Linen clung damp against her skin. From the window, the muted sounds of the street rose. A cart's wheel stuttering across a rut, the faint whimper of a tired dog. She moved to the shuttered window, parting the cloth with care. Below, the alley lay strewn with pale dust. A stray cat watched from beneath a broken cart, its eyes narrow against the fading light. Leonard's gaze lingered, fingers resting upon the worn wood. Beyond the rooftops, the towers of the cathedral glowed faintly in the haze, stone softened by the thickened air. A folded letter lay upon her table, edges curled beneath the press of the day's heat. Its wax seal, once sharp, had softened, edges blurred. Her hand hovered above it, then drew back. For soldiers, within the dim guardhouse of the Petit Pont, blades were drawn slowly from their scabbards, edges wiped with oil-stained cloth. Voices rose in muted song, low and rough, blending with the creak of leather and steel. For peasants, along the riverbank, bundles of flax were laid to soak, their pale stems drifting beneath the slow current. A child crouched upon the stones, fingers trailing through the water's surface, tracing circles that dissolved beneath the ripples. Within the kitchens of the Hôtel de Sang, the last flames were coaxed into embers. Bowls of salted fish and coarse bread were set upon the long table. A single lantern swayed upon its chain, light shifting across worn flagstones. For Leonard, the hour pressed inward, thick with unseen weight. She moved to the narrow hearth, fingers tracing the carved edge of a worn stone. Her breath stirred the faintest dust upon its surface. A comb lay upon the table's edge. She lifted it with slow care, each stroke through tangled hair deliberate, measured. Across the room, the single candle guttered low, its light bending beneath the press of the air, and in that hush, time seemed to stretch thin. The creak of a board, the distant murmur of a closing door, the faint scratch of linen against skin. As the sky deepened toward dusk, the city shifted once more. Bells tolled the vespers hour. Footsteps echoed in slow cadence through the cloister walks. And beneath the nave, a forgotten light flickered alone. The sun slid lower, its glare softened beneath a veil of dust and cloud. But the heat remained. Paris did not cool, it shifted. The warmth of the day seeped deeper into stone and earth. Each surface seemed to breathe in slow rhythm with the thickened air. In the crooked lanes beyond the Rue de la Verrerie, shadows stretched long across uneven cobbles. Shutters stood half open. Voices softened to murmurs behind thin walls. For merchants, the day's ledgers lay closed beneath smooth stones. Coins were counted with slow, deliberate movements, edges worn warm beneath the press of many hands. For scribes, the dim scriptoria of Saint-Martin echoed faintly with the scratch of quill on parchment. A single scribe remained, his gaze drawn to the slow drip of wax pooling at the base of a forgotten candle. And for peasants, beyond the northern gate, where the city's breath gave way to fields and sky, the hours moved with weary purpose. Etienne guided his oxen along a narrow path, cart creaking beneath its load of sun-baked straw. The beasts moved slowly, flanks heaving, eyes dull beneath the lingering heat. Dust rose with each step, pale clouds hanging in the still air before settling once more upon earth and skin. The river lay to the south, its surface dull beneath the fading light. Flax bundles drifted in the shallows, reeds swayed without sound. Etienne's cart drew near the low stone arch of the Pont aux Meuniers. Beneath it, cool shadows pooled thick and deep. He paused there, hand upon the worn wooden rail. For a moment, time slowed. The oxen's breath rose in visible plumes, damp and steady. Across the water a heron stood motionless amid the reeds, neck bent in patient curve. Etienne wiped his brow with a frayed sleeve, gaze lingering upon the water's muted gleam. A single droplet of sweat traced the line of his temple, falling unseen to the dust below. For soldiers, the watch at the Saint-Lazare gate shifted uneasily. Steel rang softly against stone as weapons were checked and shouldered once more. A leather flask passed between hands, its contents warm beneath the hour's press. For peasants. Within a narrow yard beyond the city's wall, Jean tended her small garden beneath the slanting sun. Fingers moved among brittle stems, gathering what remained of the day's yield. Wilted herbs lay in her basket, sage, rue, a scattering of limp chamomile. Her breath moved slow and steady, each motion measured. Nearby a wooden pail stood half-filled with water drawn from the well. The surface quivered faintly beneath the breeze, or perhaps beneath her own faint movement. For scribes, the folded edge of a vellum page curled beneath unseen currents. In a shadowed alcove, a forgotten document rested atop a stone slab, its seal softened by the day's heat. In the deepening hush of the outer fields, Etienne turned once more to his path. The oxen moved forward, cartwheels carving faint grooves in the dry earth. Above, the sky deepened to a muted gold. The first stars lay hidden still, waiting beneath the veil of day. And beneath worn cloth and calloused hand, the pulse of the city echoed faintly on. In the distance, a bell tolled softly, its voice carrying across fields and stone. And through forgotten corridors, soft footsteps echoed. The hour drew late, yet the warmth clung to the stones. Paris inched toward twilight beneath a sky still pale with lingering heat. Along the river's edge, the water whispered faintly against worn pilings, its voice thin, uncertain. In the streets, shadows thickened. Dust hung in slow, shimmering clouds, stirred by passing feet. The breath of the city moved heavy and deep. For scribes, within the cloistered halls of Saint Genevieve, ink dried upon a half-written page. The lone scribe traced the margin with careful fingers, breath measured, eyes drawn to the slender flame wavering beside him. For women, the courtyard wells stood quieter now. Clay pitchers rested cool against stone. Damp cloths hung limp across narrow windows, fluttering faintly in the dusk. And for merchants, the counting rooms behind the Rue de la Ferronnerie hummed with quiet purpose. Alain, master of cloth and spice, moved through the shadowed interior of his house. His steps were soft upon the worn boards. The faint rustle of wool marked his passage. Candles burned low upon the long table. Pools of wavering light caught upon the metal edges of scales, upon the smooth curve of a ledger's clasp. Beyond the shuttered windows, the city stirred in slower rhythm. The bells of Saint-Merry rang the hour, each note trailing into the thick air like a thread drawn thin. Alain paused before the open ledger. His fingers traced the columns once more, lips moving without sound. A folded letter lay beside the ink-stained cloth, sealed that morning, still waiting. Through the narrow door, the shop beyond stood in gathering gloom. Bolts of cloth lay stacked in careful measure, linen, wool, faded silk brought from across distant seas. The scent of cedar and dust hung in the air. For peasants, in the outer streets, carts rattled homeward beneath fading banners. Dogs trotted wearily through drifting shadows. Voices rose in soft, spare tones. Words exchanged beneath the press of the hour. For merchants, Alain's hands moved with practiced ease. Scales tipped, coins clinked in measured cadence. Fingers brushed stray grains of spice from the dark surface of the counter. Cinnamon, nutmeg, sharp-edged clove. A single coin, worn smooth by many hands, spun once upon the wood before coming to rest. Through the open doorway a boy entered, barefoot, breath quickened by the day's close heat. He bore a sealed pouch beneath his arm, its edges damp with the faint trace of river air. Alain accepted the pouch in silence. The boy's eyes flicked toward the cool recess of the shop, toward the gleam of metal, the deep folds of cloth. A nod passed between them. The boy withdrew. Footsteps faded swiftly down the stone corridor. For scribes, beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Hôtel de Ville, shadows deepened across the painted beams. A forgotten quill lay upon a cracked inkstone, its tip dried and pale. For Alain, the pouch yielded letters folded close, sealed with rough wax. Fingers traced each seal, an old habit, slow and careful. One was opened, its contents spread across the worn cloth. Figures, names, the faint outline of a distant city drawn in uncertain hand. The hour lengthened. A single candle guttered low, its wax spilling in slow arcs across the bronze sconce. Alain's gaze followed the curve of the melted trail, breath shallow in the thickened air. Beyond the shuttered windows, the sky deepened to muted violet. The first stars flickered faintly, trembling against the unseen currents of the upper air. For women, in the rooms above, linens were drawn fresh across narrow beds. A basin of cool water stood upon a stone sill, its surface quivering beneath unseen hands. For merchants, Alain's pen moved once more across the ledger. Ink flowed in slow rhythm, each letter formed with deliberate care. Beneath the table's edge, the folded letter remained untouched, and through the unseen cracks, salt whispered faintly still. The streets of Paris shifted beneath the deepening blue of evening. The heat of the day lingered in stone and timber. Air moved thick through the narrow lanes, rising in faint eddies from the worn cobbles. Windows stood half open, voices drifted low across the gathering dark. Beyond the great towers of the Hôtel de Ville, the river glistened beneath the fading sky, its currents slow, silver-veined. For scribes, the dim alcoves of the Palais de Justice held the last traces of light. Quills rested upon folded parchment. Ink darkened beneath the thin glow of a guttering flame. For women, behind shaded shutters, cool cloths were pressed to weary skin. Fingers traced the rims of pewter basins. Breath moved slow and shallow. And for soldiers, the watch at the Bastille held to its measured rhythm. Within the outer guardroom, leather creaked beneath shifting mail. The ring of steel echoed softly as blades were checked, straps tightened. Beneath their helms, faces gleamed faintly with sweat drawn by the heavy air. Jean stood beside the thick oaken door, gaze fixed upon the narrow slit that opened to the twilight beyond. His breath moved in even cadence, hands resting upon the curve of his shield. Across the room, the captain's voice rose, low, deliberate, assigning the night's stations. Names passed between them like stones across water, each word settling with weight. Jean's place lay upon the southern wall, where the stone rose sheer above the river's slow gleam. There, shadows pooled thick and deep, and the breath of the city faded beneath the rush of unseen currents. For peasants, beneath the gatehouse, carts passed in slow procession. Wheels ground softly against the worn stones. Lanterns swayed in the dusk. A lone figure guided a mule beneath the arch, its hooves striking faint sparks in the deepening dark. For soldiers, Jean climbed the narrow stair, each step worn smooth by countless feet. His hand brushed the cool curve of the stone with each ascent, an old habit, measured and sure. Above, the parapet opened to the sky. The city lay spread beneath him, rooftops glowing faint with the last light, shadows lengthening across empty squares. Beyond, the river wound in soft silver through the darkening land. Jean's breath caught faintly in his throat. The air here moved freer, cool fingers upon heated skin. He leaned upon the stone, gaze drawn to the shimmer of distant lamps across the bridges. The sound of the river rose beneath him, a low, ceaseless murmur. For scribes, within the library of St. Victor, a single scholar moved beneath arched vaults. Fingers traced faded script. Candlelight flickered across worn vellum. For Jean, time slowed upon the wall. The weight of blade and mail pressed against tired limbs. Yet beneath the hush of the hour, his senses stirred, attuned to the faint shift of shadow, to the whisper of unseen steps. A folded scrap of cloth rested within his belt. A letter, hastily sealed, words pressed in hurried hand. Its presence lingered beneath each breath, a quiet anchor. For women, beyond the court of miracles, soft voices rose in hushed song. Linen hung across narrow streets, edges fluttering faint against the cooling air. A child's laugh rang sudden and clear, then faded once more into the hush. For soldiers. Beneath the wide sky, Jean traced the worn edge of his shield, fingers lingering upon the faded emblem. Far below, a lone boat drifted beneath the arches of the Pont Marie, its lantern swinging in slow rhythm. The water parted in soft ripples beneath its bow. The hour deepened. Stars emerged, scattered faint across the velvet sky. The first breath of true night stirred through the city, cool, clean, edged with promise. Jean straightened, gaze lifted to the dark beyond. His breath moved steady, his place held sure, and beneath the stone a voice waited still. Night deepened across the stones of Paris. The heat of the day lay trapped within walls and streets, a slow, unseen tide. Above, the sky unfurled velvet dark. Stars flickered faint against its depth. In the heart of the city, the river whispered beneath its bridges, its voice low, steady, timeless. For merchants, behind bolted doors, coins were counted in muted cadence. Fingers traced ledgers by the glow of fading lamps. Beneath the worn boards, folded letters waited beneath stone weights. For women, the courtyard stood silent. Water cooled in clay pitchers. Linen was pressed across weary skin. The scent of lavender and dust mingled in the still air. And for scribes, within the cloistered library of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, a single lamp burned against the dark. Mathieu bent low above a heavy tome, its pages spread wide upon the oak table. The words beneath his hand shimmered faintly, gold and ink caught in the wavering light. Around him the vaulted space held its breath. Stone columns rose into shadow. Arches whispered of long-forgotten prayers. The hush was deep, the hour late. The scribe's quill moved in slow rhythm. Ink flowed in careful lines, each stroke deliberate, measured. Beneath his breath, words formed soundless, tracing the shapes upon the page. Beyond the high windows, the towers of the city stood dark against the sky. The wind stirred faintly through narrow panes, lifting motes of dust in languid dance. For peasants, in the outer lanes, the last carts rattled homeward. Dogs dozed in cool doorways. Voices rose low and spare beneath the weight of the hour. For scribes. Mathieu paused, fingers resting upon the parchment's edge. His gaze lifted to the lone flame flickering beside him, its light trembling, wax pooling slow upon the iron sconce. He drew a folded letter from beneath a stack of scrolls. Its seal bore the faded mark of an old house, its edges curled with age. Breath held, he broke the seal, unfolding the page with careful hands. The words within swam faint beneath his eyes, blurred by the press of weariness. For women, beyond the convent walls, voices rose in soft chant. Candles flickered in darkened halls. The scent of beeswax and old stone lingered in the air. For Mathieu, the letter rested now upon the table, its contents pressed into the silence. He turned once more to his work, quill lifted with steady grace. Ink trailed across the page, each letter shaped with reverence, with care. Time thinned beneath the hush, the weight of stone and shadow drawing close. Beyond the library's door, the cloister lay wrapped in night. A lone figure moved beneath its arches, breath slow, footsteps softened by worn flagstones. For scribes, the lamp's flame wavered once more. Mathieu's gaze followed its tremble, his hand stilled upon the page. A single droplet of wax slid down the sconce, its path slow, deliberate, shining faint against the dark. The hour lengthened. In the hush, the city seemed to pause. Its pulse softened, stretched thin beneath the weight of stone and sky. Mathieu closed the tome with gentle care. Fingers traced the worn cover, breath steady. The letter remained upon the table, its words lingering in the silent dark. And beneath the nave, a forgotten light flickered alone. Night pressed deeper upon the stones of Paris. The city lay wrapped in layered shadow. Walls, towers, and spires softened beneath the dark. Above, stars shimmered cold and distant. Below, the river wound slow and black through its ancient course. The breath of the streets moved faint and cool now, stirred by a breeze drawn from unseen places. For merchants, ledgers lay closed beneath pale hands. Coins rested in neat stacks, their metal dulled beneath the wan light of a single taper. For women, shutters were drawn tight. Candles burned low beside narrow beds. Linens were smoothed with slow, practiced care. And for pilgrims, the long road ended here, beneath the heavy stones of the city. Aline stood at the edge of the Parvis Notre Dame, cloak drawn close against the chill. Her feet ached beneath the dust of many leagues. Her eyes lifted toward the towers rising dark against the stars. Breath moved slow between parted lips. In one hand, she clutched a worn satchel. In the other, a slender staff, its wood scarred by many paths. The great doors of the cathedral stood closed, their iron studs gleaming faintly beneath the distant torchlight. Around her, the square lay near empty, footsteps few, voices hushed. For scribes, within the chapter house, a lone figure transcribed the last lines of a battered missal. Ink dried upon the page as the candle's flame guttered low. For Aline, each breath seemed drawn from the very stones. She crossed the square with slow steps, staff tapping softly upon the worn slabs. Beneath her feet, the marks of countless pilgrims pressed deep into the earth, grooves worn smooth by hope and need. At the edge of the great doors she knelt. Her fingers traced the cold iron, breath catching faintly in her throat. The silence held her there, wrapped close as any cloak. For peasants, in the lanes beyond, carts stood silent beneath slumping awnings. A single dog stirred, lifting its head to the breeze before sinking once more into sleep. For Aline, time thinned. The weight of her journey lay across her shoulders, miles measured in blisters and prayer. The cathedral rose above, vast and indifferent, its stones worn smooth by centuries of longing. She reached within her satchel, drawing forth a folded scrap of linen. Within it, a single token, a smooth river stone, worn pale by many years, its edges pressed warm against her palm. Breath held, she placed it at the foot of the door, fingers lingering upon its surface. For soldiers, along the eastern wall, the watch paced in slow rhythm. Steel rang softly beneath leather. The faint gleam of helms caught the edge of starlight. For pilgrims, across the square another figure knelt in mirrored hush. Two voices unspoken, two prayers drawn into the quiet breath of stone and sky. Aline rose, hands trembling faintly. Her gaze lingered upon the great doors once more, then turned toward the narrow lane that led away, toward the darkened cloister where pilgrims might find rest. Each step was measured, deliberate. Beneath the archway she paused. The sound of her breath mingled with the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the night wind. For scribes, Beneath the vaulted ceiling of the library, a candle burned to its final inch. Wax pooled upon the stone, its edge trembling in the hush. For Aline, the path ahead stretched into shadow. Yet beneath her weariness, beneath the ache of flesh and bone, a deeper thread stirred, a pulse of quiet hope woven through the long dark of the night. The city around her breathed slow and deep. Bells tolled faint upon the distant air, and through forgotten corridors soft footsteps echoed. The small hours gathered over Paris, cloaking its stones in deeper shadow. Beneath the sky's cold velvet, the city breathed in slow, unseen rhythm. Lanterns flickered faint behind shuttered windows. The river's voice deepened to a soft, endless murmur. Along the crooked lanes, footsteps grew few. The air, once pressed with day's heat, cooled in pockets beneath the arches and eaves. For merchants, coins slept beneath folded cloth. Scales stood balanced, their arms still beneath the hush. For soldiers, steel was set aside for the hour. Helms rested upon worn benches, breath moved slow beneath thick woolen cloaks. And for women, the work of the day lingered in dim-lit rooms. In a narrow chamber above the Rue des Lombards, Isabeau moved through the hush. Her fingers traced the rim of a clay basin, water cool against weary skin. The small mirror upon the wall caught the tremble of a single candle's flame, its glow folding across pale linen, across dark eyes rimmed with sleepless hours. The day's tasks had pressed long. Bread kneaded beneath stiff arms, linen scrubbed raw upon stone, herbs gathered in heat thick with dust. Now, in this held breath of night, the weight of silence settled close. For scribes, the last pages of a ledger stood open beneath cooling ink. A lone quill rested beside the empty space, its point dulled by the press of time. For Isabeau, breath moved deep and measured. She gathered her hair with slow fingers, each twist deliberate, practiced. The wooden comb lay upon the sill, its teeth smoothed by years of use. The scent of lavender lingered in the folds of cloth nearby, sharp beneath the older trace of ash and river air. For peasants, beyond the southern gate, small fires burned low in the yards. Shadows leaned long across tilled earth. Voices rose in soft, uneven cadence. For women, a folded bundle waited upon the chest, a child's garment, mended anew beneath dim light. Needle and thread lay beside it, silver glint softened by the hour. Isabeau's gaze lingered upon it. Beyond the window the lane lay empty, save for the faint drift of pale leaves stirred by unseen breath. She drew the candle closer, its flame trembling in her grasp. Wax pooled thick upon the iron dish, edges curved in molten arcs. Time stretched thin. Each breath marked the slow ebb of the night, each sound, each movement caught in the soft web of shadow. For soldiers, along the quay, boots echoed faint upon stone. A single watchman passed beneath the arches, lantern swinging in slow rhythm. For Isabeau, the candle's light traced the lines of her hand as she reached for the bundle. Cloth whispered beneath her fingers, smooth where it had been worn thin by care. She folded it once more, breath catching faintly beneath her ribs. The chamber pressed close with its silence. Beneath the worn beams, beneath the faint drift of river chill, her gaze lifted once more to the narrow window. Stars shimmered pale against the void. For scribes, a lone scroll remained unopened upon the shelf. Dust lay soft upon its surface, undisturbed. For Isabeau, the hour grew still. The candle guttered low, its flame leaned toward the dark. Beside it, a single droplet of wax traced the curve of the dish, falling in silence. And beneath worn velvet, the keys sang faintly once more. Night lay heavy upon the edges of the city. Beyond the high towers and crowded streets, the land unfolded beneath a pale sky. Fields stretched dark beneath the stars. Hedgerows whispered faint against the breath of the wind. The hour had turned, yet the world held to its slow rhythm. Earth, stone, and river bound in quiet pulse. For scribes, quills rested upon dry parchment. Ink cooled in its well, the last line of script caught in the thin light of the dying flame. For merchants, chests stood locked. Bolts slid home with steady hands. The rustle of cloth whispered beneath the hush. And for peasants, the day's toil lingered in aching limbs. In a low house beyond the Saint Antoine gate, Henri stirred upon his narrow cot. The warmth of the earth rose beneath the rush-strewn floor. The scent of wood smoke clung to the beams above. Beside him, his wife Jeanne breathed slow and deep. Across the room, a small figure curled beneath a faded woolen blanket, a child's shape outlined in the faint gleam of starlight. Henri swung his legs to the floor. The boards creaked beneath his weight, bare feet finding cool stone. The hour pressed close. He reached for the clay cup beside the hearth, lifting it with steady hands. Water touched his lips, cool, metallic. Breath moved slow through parted teeth. For soldiers, along the outer ramparts, torches flickered against the stone. Shadows leaned sharp and long. Bootsteps rang hollow across worn walkways. For peasants, Henri moved to the small window. The latch gave beneath calloused fingers. The wooden shutter swung wide. The night breathed in, a tide of cool and damp. Beyond the fields, a thin band of mist traced the line of the river. He leaned upon the sill, gaze drawn across the dark. The stars shone sharp above the tiled roofs of the distant city. Within the house, the faint creak of a cradle stirred the silence. Jeanne shifted beneath her blanket. Her breath caught faint, then settled once more. For women, beyond the cloister walls, a single lamp burned low. Soft voices rose in chant. Linen veils shifted in rhythm with each step. For Henri, the hush deepened. His hands moved with slow purpose, lifting a folded cloth, checking the rope-bound bundles that lay beneath the bench. Tools wrapped in worn leather, coils of twine, the smooth curve of a knife's handle. A breath held, then released. Beneath the eaves, the first bird stirred, its wing beat sharp against the hush. For scribes, within the archives of the Petit Châtelet, a scroll was returned to its place. Fingers traced its spine, lingering upon the faded script pressed deep into the vellum. For peasants, Henri knelt beside the hearth, fingers coaxing pale embers to life. A single spark caught upon dry kindling, its glow faint, growing. The scent of smoke rose sharp into the air. A cradle creaked once more. The child stirred, small fingers curling in sleep. Jeanne's eyes opened, gaze finding Henri across the dim space. No words passed between them, only the slow rhythm of breath, shared and steady. For soldiers, beyond the southern gate, a lone rider passed beneath the arch. Hooves struck soft upon the packed earth. A cloak billowed faint against the breeze. For Henri, the flame caught, its light rising in gentle arcs across the hearth. He watched it a moment, hands still. Time thinned. The weight of the coming day pressed soft upon his shoulders. Earth to till, stones to lift, water to draw. Yet beneath the hush, a deeper thread stirred. A patient strength bound in the breath of stone and soil. The sky lightened faint upon the rim of the world, and across the cold beams, shadows gathered in silence. The first breath of dawn touched the stones of Paris. Above the slate-tiled roofs, the sky paled, soft hues of ash and pearl spreading slow across the east. The city stirred beneath its cloak of shadow and dust. The river whispered beneath its bridges, its voice low, unbroken. A faint mist rose from its depths, winding through the arches, veiling stone and iron. For soldiers, steel gleamed cold in the watchroom. Blades were checked beneath guttering lamps, buckles drawn tight with weary hands. For scribes, beneath vaulted beams, quills moved in silence. Ink caught the faint glow of dawn, each line a thread drawn slow across the page. And for merchants, the hour called with quiet insistence. In a shop upon the Rue de la Tixeranderie, Lucien stirred from his narrow cot. The chill of the floor seeped through worn soles as he crossed to the window, drawing the shutters wide. Cool air washed in, tainted with river damp yet welcome after the still breath of night. Beyond, the street lay empty but for the faint scrape of broom upon stone. A boy swept pale dust into slow spirals, each stroke careful, unhurried. For women, within high chambers, braids were woven with deft fingers, linen smoothed across narrow beds, the scent of lavender folded into the hush. For Lucien, the day began in ritual. He drew a cloth across the long oak counter, tracing its grain with slow hands. Scales were uncovered, weights polished to dull gleam. Beneath the low shelves, bolts of cloth waited, linen, wool, silk from distant ports. A folded letter lay atop the ledger, its seal intact, its purpose unknown. For peasants. Beyond the city wall, carts creaked toward the gate. Axles groaned beneath sacks of grain. Voices rose in soft cadence, measured by the rhythm of hooves upon earth. For merchants, Lucien lit the small lamp above the till, its flame flickering into fragile life. Shadows retreated, drawn back to the corners where old ledgers slept beneath dust. The shop door was unbarred with practiced motion. Wood groaned faint against iron. The latch fell silent. Time stretched. Through the wide pane of glass, the first footfalls marked the street. A woman passed, basket drawn close against her hip. Behind her, a man led a small mule, its breath misting in the cool air. For scribes, beneath the cloistered walks, a novice swept thin leaves into careful piles. His movements traced slow arcs upon the worn stone. For Lucien, the first customer of the day approached, a tailor with sharp eyes, cloth samples folded beneath one arm. Words passed low between them. Coins exchanged hands, cool against warm flesh. The scale tipped beneath its burden, weights aligned with deliberate care. A bolt of cloth was measured in slow rhythm, each pass of the yardstick marked by breath and pause. For soldiers, the guard at the Petit Pont shifted beneath mail and leather. Eyes scanned the empty river road, fingers flexed upon worn hilts. For merchants, Lucien returned to his counter. The letter lay untouched. His gaze lingered upon it. Fingers traced the edge of the seal. Breath moved deep, slow. Beyond the glass, the street thickened with life. Carts rattled past in uneven cadence. Voices rose sharp beneath the thinning mist. A boy ran by, laughter spilling into the morning air. For Lucien, the lamp's flame bent beneath a sudden draft. Its light trembled across the ledger, across the letter sealed still. He reached for it at last, lifting the folded weight with measured hands. Wax cracked beneath his thumb. The page unfolded, its words blooming faint beneath the rising light. Time held its breath, and through forgotten corridors, soft footsteps echoed. Morning thickened across the stones of Paris. The sun, veiled by high cloud, cast a pale, diffused glow. The river wound dark and slow through the city's heart, its surface unbroken save for the faint trace of oar and keel. Above, the towers stood silent. Within the winding streets, life stirred with measured breath. For merchants, shutters swung wide. Voices rose beneath painted signs. Coins rang in cautious cadence across worn counters. For scribes, beneath vaulted halls, quills scratched slow across parchment. Ink caught the dull light. Pages whispered beneath steady hands. And for soldiers, the guard mustered in the courtyard of the Grand Châtelet. Steel rang faint against steel. Blades were drawn in practiced rhythm, helms adjusted with deliberate care. Etienne moved among them, boots soft upon the worn flagstones. His gaze passed across each man in turn, eyes sharp beneath the curve of his helm. The captain's voice carried low across the space, words clipped, precise. Orders pressed into the hush like stone into sand. For peasants, beneath the rising sun, fields shimmered with pale gold. Scythes swung in broad arcs, grain whispered beneath their bite. For soldiers, Etienne checked the strap of his baldric, fingers deft and sure. Leather creaked beneath his touch. A breath drawn deep, a nod exchanged. Beneath the high arch, the gate yawned wide. Sunlight spilled in thin bands across the stone, cool where shadow clung. They moved as one, steps measured, shields close. The city awaited. For women, beneath shaded eaves, looms stirred to life. Threads drawn taut sang soft beneath the shuttle's pass. For Etienne, the streets unfolded in slow rhythm. The Rue Saint-Denis lay awash in early trade. Carts rattled beneath laden weight. Hawkers called in muted cadence. Eyes watched from shaded doorways. Beneath worn cloaks, hands rested upon purse strings. The guard moved steady through the press. Etienne's gaze swept each face, measured, calm, unreadable. For scribes, in the chamber of records, seals were pressed to cooling wax. The scent of parchment and oil hung thick in the air. For soldiers, the patrol wound through narrow lanes, boots tracing the dust of countless feet. A merchant's shout rose sudden, sharp, coins scattered upon the stone. Figures shifted, voices edged with heat. Etienne's hand settled upon his hilt. Breath slowed, gaze fixed. A moment drawn taut, then eased. The press thinned. The guard passed on. For women, beneath the cloistered walks, herbs were gathered in careful bundles. The scent of rosemary and sage drifted soft upon the air. For Etienne, the river road opened wide. Beneath the span of the Pont au Change, shadows pooled deep. Water lapped slow against the pilings. A boatman's voice rose in quiet song. He paused at the parapet, gaze drawn to the dark sweep of water. The city's breath moved slow beneath the clouded sky. A folded scrap of cloth rested within his gauntlet. A child's token, lost to the tide. Fingers traced its edge, breath catching faint. For scribes, beneath the abbey's high vaults, a lone figure bent in prayer. Candlelight wavered across stone and skin. For soldiers, the hour turned. Etienne's step resumed, steady upon the worn stones. The guard moved with him, shadows beneath the shifting sun. The city unfolded ahead, walls of stone, hearts of breath and blood, and through unseen cracks, salt whispered faintly still. Mid-morning pressed upon the stones of Paris. The pale sun drifted behind high cloud, its light thin and without warmth. Across the city, shutters hung half open. Voices moved soft beneath the hush. The river wound slow beneath its bridges, the tide drawn thick with silt and shadow. Above, the towers stood dark against the silver sky. For merchants, stalls unfurled faded cloth, scales tipped in careful rhythm, coin passed in deliberate hands. For soldiers, steel rang soft in narrow streets, blades checked, shields drawn close in practiced ease. And for scribes, the hush of stone and vellum held its breath. Within the scriptoria of Saint Victor, light filtered through narrow panes. The scent of parchment and oil hung thick beneath the arches. Bernard bent low above his work. quill steady between ink-stained fingers. Each stroke traced the faded script with reverence, with care. Around him, the vaulted hall breathed slow, columns rising into shadow, arches wound with time. For peasants, carts rumbled through the outer lanes. Hooves struck soft upon the worn earth. Voices rose in low cadence beneath shifting skies. For scribes, Bernard's gaze followed the curve of each letter. The ancient text shimmered beneath the pale light, edges softened by the press of age. Ink caught upon the quill's tip, breath held as it touched the page. Across the hall, a single candle guttered faint. Its flame leaned toward the draft, light and shadow drawn in fragile dance. For women, within shaded gardens, hands gathered herbs with deft touch. The sharp scent of thyme and rue folded into the cool air. For Bernard, the hush deepened. A folded scrap of parchment rested beneath his palm, a note drawn swift in the early hour. Its words pressed faint into the fibers, meaning held close in the curve of the script. His gaze lingered upon it. For soldiers. Along the northern wall, the watch stood sure. Eyes scanned the empty road. Fingers traced the worn edge of steel. For scribes, Bernard turned the page with careful hands. The vellum whispered beneath his touch. Breath moved slow through parted lips. A single bead of wax slipped from the candle, tracing a slow path to the iron dish below. Time thinned. The voices of the city faded beyond the high walls. Life held at distance beneath stone and sky. For peasants, within the market square, baskets brimmed with grain and root. The scent of earth clung to rough cloth and calloused skin. For Bernard, the final line of the page drew near. Ink flowed in steady thread. Letters rose beneath the quill's dance. Breath caught, released. The page complete, he set the quill aside. Fingers brushed the script's edge, soft, deliberate. The hush held close. For women, beyond the cloistered walks, linen fluttered in faint breeze. A single thread caught upon the stone, trembling in the light. For scribes, Bernard drew the folded note once more to hand. Wax cracked beneath his thumb. The parchment unfurled with slow care. Words whispered into the hush. Lines drawn from distant voice pressed in ink and breath. A moment held. The candle's flame bent low, its light pooling thin across the page. And beneath worn velvet, the keys sang faintly once more. The tide of the city moved slow beneath a pale sky. Paris breathed beneath its stones, walls warm with the lingering press of sun, streets damp with the breath of river and air. Clouds traced thin shadows across the towers. Light shifted in quiet arcs upon the worn facades. The river spoke in low murmur beneath the arches, its song steady, deep. For merchants, stalls closed in careful rhythm. Locks turned beneath practiced hands, ledgers folded with slow precision. For soldiers, boots struck faint upon stone. Eyes traced narrow lanes, steel rang soft beneath the hush. And for pilgrims, the road led ever onward. Anselme passed beneath the high arch of the Petit Pont, staff tapping upon the worn stone. His cloak hung damp against weary shoulders. The dust of many leagues pressed thick upon his boots. Breath moved slow between parted lips. Beneath the weight of the city, his steps held to steady rhythm, one then another. For scribes, quills rested in dry ink. Pages lay beneath pale hands. The hush of parchment and breath mingled beneath the arching vault. For Anselme, the river's voice rose beneath his path. He paused at the parapet, gaze drawn to the dark coil of water below. A single boat drifted beneath the span, its lantern swaying in slow arc. Fingers curled against the rough wood of the rail. Breath caught faint upon the air. For peasants, beneath the eastern gate, carts rattled toward the fields. Wheels traced deep grooves upon the earth. Voices rose in worn cadence. For pilgrims, the narrow lanes wound through stone and shade. Anselm moved through their hush, staff steady beneath his grasp. The scents of the city pressed close, spice, dust, the faint edge of river and forge. Shutters hung open above. Pale faces watched with tired eyes. Below, dogs stirred beneath carts, eyes tracking each step. For women, within dim rooms, thread drew through cloth in patient rhythm. Fingers traced worn seams. The hush of the hour folded close. For Anselm, the road led him beneath the towers of Notre Dame. He crossed the broad square with measured pace, each footfall marked in dust. The great doors rose dark and still before him. Their iron studs caught the thin light. At the threshold he knelt, hands pressed to stone, head bowed beneath the weight of miles and prayer. Breath moved slow. The hush of the square held close, broken only by the faint cry of gulls wheeling high above. For scribes, within the cloister, a lone figure bent in study. Candlelight flickered across pale skin. The scratch of quill rose thin upon the air. For pilgrims, Anselm rose once more. From the fold of his cloak he drew a token, a simple wooden cross, edges smoothed by many hands. Fingers lingered upon its worn surface. Breath moved deep. He placed it at the foot of the door, gaze lingering upon its shape. The sky shifted above, pale to gray. For soldiers, along the quay, lanterns flared to life. Shadows leaned long across stone and water. For Anselm, the path drew him onward. Through narrow streets he walked, staff tapping soft against the stones. The hush of the city folded about him, breath of stone, voice of water, rhythm of unseen feet. At the turning of the lane he paused. A folded letter rested upon a shuttered sill, edges caught by the faint breath of wind. Eyes lingered upon it, breath held, and through forgotten corridors soft footsteps echoed. Afternoon wore thin upon the stones of Paris. The sun drifted pale and high, its light washed through veils of thin cloud. Shadows leaned soft against the walls. Dust hung in faint spirals within the slow-moving air. The river moved beneath its bridges in steady breath, a dark ribbon winding through the city's heart. For merchants, bolts of cloth were measured and folded. Coins passed in quiet cadence, scales tipped beneath slender weights. For soldiers, mail gleamed faint beneath worn surcoats. Eyes scanned narrow streets. Bootsteps marked the earth with even rhythm. And for women, the hour called for stillness. In a narrow house upon the Rue de la Vendière, Marguerite moved through the shaded rooms. Her fingers brushed linen smooth across the washboard. The scent of lye and lavender rose sharp in the air. Water lapped faint within the basin, light caught in thin arcs upon its surface. For scribes, ink drew slow across pale parchment. Quills traced the flow of words. The hush of scriptoria held its breath. For Marguerite, the weight of the day pressed close. Her arms ached from the morning's labor. Buckets drawn from deep wells, cloth wrung hard against stone. Yet beneath the hush, her breath moved slow, steady. From the window above, light spilled in soft bands across the worn boards. The shadows of leaves danced faint upon the sill. For peasants, beyond the city wall, earth turned beneath strong hands. Blades sang through brittle stalks. Grain whispered beneath each cut. For women, Marguerite lifted the linen once more. Water streamed from its folds, pattering soft upon the basin's rim. She smoothed it across the wooden rack, fingers tracing each crease with care. A folded letter lay upon the table nearby, its edges curled, seal pressed beneath trembling wax. Her gaze lingered upon it. For soldiers. Beneath the eastern gate, the watch stood silent. Spears tipped with steel caught the thin light. Shadows pooled beneath arch and wall. For Marguerite. The hush deepened. She crossed to the hearth, stirring the faint embers to life. A small pot simmered upon the iron trivet, herbs steeped in thin broth, scent rising warm through the dim. Fingers brushed the rim of a chipped cup. Breath moved in slow rhythm, drawn from the heart of stone and air. For scribes, beneath high windows, scrolls were unfurled with reverence. The scent of wax and vellum folded into the hush. For women, in dim alcoves, needles passed through cloth with patient grace. Threads drawn taut caught the light in slender arcs. For Marguerite, the folded letter drew her hand at last. She lifted it with care, fingers tracing the worn seal. Breath caught faint. The wax cracked beneath gentle pressure. The words within spoke of distant voice, lines pressed in uneven hand, meaning drawn through miles of road and memory. Time stilled. Beyond the shutter, the faint cry of a hawker rose, drawn thin upon the afternoon air. For soldiers. Steel rang soft within the armory. Blades were set in line, helms wiped clean beneath practiced hands. For Marguerite. The letter rested upon her lap. Her gaze lingered upon the fading script, breath moving slow. The pot upon the hearth hissed faint as steam rose in slow spirals, and through forgotten corridors, soft footsteps echoed. The day wore on, and the breath of the city grew heavy once more. Above Paris, the sky shifted from silver to leaden gray. The light, though muted, pressed close, its weight seeping into stone and skin alike. The river moved thick beneath the arches, dark with silt, its voice low and constant. For merchants. Shutters leaned upon worn hinges, scales tipped beneath tired fingers. Coins rang dull against oak and brass. For scribes, quills dragged through thickening ink. The last lines of the hour's labor swam upon the page, and for peasants, the fields called louder than the bells. Outside the Saint-Denis gate, beyond the last stone outposts of the city, fields lay wide beneath the pale sky. Gaspar moved through the rows with slow, steady rhythm. His scythe sang with each stroke, sharp arc, pause, breath. The grain stood brittle beneath the blade, stalks whispered in surrender. For soldiers. Along the southern wall, the watch shifted stance. Fingers flexed upon spear shafts, eyes narrowed against the dimming light. For peasants. The earth beneath Gaspard's feet cracked beneath long hours of sun. Dust clung to sweat-damp skin. Breath moved deep beneath the weight of toil. Nearby, a cart waited beneath the lone shadow of a crooked elm. Wheels leaned into the earth, their spokes lined with the pale trace of recent rain. His wife, Anne, knelt beneath the shade, fingers deft among gathered bundles. Each stalk was bound with care, set aside beneath linen cloth. For scribes, within the cloister's heart, candles stood half-burnt. The faint scratch of quill rose beneath the hush of vaulted stone. For Gaspard, time stretched. Each swing marked the day's slow measure, one then another, breath caught and spent. His gaze lifted once to the cloud-choked sky. No rain, not yet. A folded scrap of cloth pressed against his belt. A charm given in passing, words whispered for strength beneath the morning light. For merchants, ledgers closed beneath the weight of stone. Seals pressed firm into wax, breath drawn deep, slow. For peasants, Anne's voice rose soft upon the air, a call, a pause. Gaspar wiped the blade with practiced hand, breath easing. The cart would fill by day's end, if the sky held. He crossed the field in measured stride, boots pressing faint marks upon the dry earth. For women, in shaded doorways, cloth was shaken free of dust. Baskets lined with green lay beneath waiting hands. For peasants, water was drawn from a narrow well. The rope creaked soft beneath Anne's pull. The bucket rose, damp and cool. She offered it with steady smile. Fingers brushed in passing, breath met breath. Gaspard drank deep, water sharp and bright against the heat of throat and limb. The sky lowered. Beyond the field's edge, the towers of Paris stood faint against the gloom, spires softened by distance and haze. For scribes, beneath the abbey's stone, ink dried upon the last line. A scroll was tied with frayed cord. Shelves breathed faint beneath the weight of memory. For peasants, the field called once more. Hands closed upon wood and steel, bodies bent beneath the rhythm of the blade. Gaspard moved through the rows in slow dance, scythe, breath, step. The cart's shadow deepened upon the earth, and beneath worn velvet, the keys sang faintly once more. Late afternoon pressed soft upon the stones of Paris. The light thinned to pale gold, slipping between towers and eaves. In narrow streets, shadows stretched long across worn cobbles. Dust rose in slow spirals beneath passing feet. The river wound beneath its bridges, broad and dark, its voice low beneath the weight of the hour. For soldiers, helms hung upon pegs. Blades were wiped clean, leather gauntlets laid aside. For scribes, lamps were trimmed in quiet rhythm. Inkpots sealed, scrolls returned to their place upon cool stone. And for merchants, the hour called for careful hands. In a shop near the Rue de la Ferronnerie, Henri moved through the fading light. The day's trade had drawn long. Bolts of cloth measured and folded, jars of rare spice weighed with practiced ease. Now, beneath the hush of late hour, he turned to the ledgers. Fingers traced neat columns. Coins were counted in deliberate cadence. The shop lay cloaked in thin shadow. Through the tall window, the street shimmered beneath the pale sky. Voices rose soft, footsteps few, for peasants. Beyond the gate, fields lay hushed beneath spent stalks. Carts stood in line, wheels dusted with earth. For merchants, Henry's gaze lingered upon the last page. A folded letter rested nearby, edges worn, seal unbroken. He reached for it with measured breath, lifting the weight of its promise between ink-stained fingers. The seal gave beneath his thumb, wax cracked faint in the silence. For women, beneath cool arches, cloth was drawn through water. Threads gleamed beneath the dim light. Hands moved in slow, steady rhythm. For Henri, the letter's words unfurled, lines traced in familiar hand, news from distant port, the promise of goods bound upstream. His breath caught faint, lips moving silent upon the words. Outside, a boy passed, whistling soft beneath the fading sun. The sound drifted thin through the open door. For soldiers, beneath the wall, the watch assembled. Spears were checked, torches drawn ready for the long night ahead. For merchants, Henri folded the letter with care, sealing it once more beneath smooth stone. He rose, moving to the tall shelves that lined the rear of the shop. There, beneath faded silk and sealed casks, he withdrew a small box, its surface worn with use. Within, a ledger older than the rest. Pages thick with ink and dust, each line a mark of years passed beneath steady hand. He opened it to the last written page. For scribes, beneath vaulted beams, a lone figure traced the edge of a manuscript. Breath moved deep beneath the hush of vellum and stone. For Henri, quill drawn fresh to ink. The line began in slow arc, figures marked in careful rhythm. The shop held its breath. Beyond the window, the light faded further. Shadows deepened upon the street. A single cart creaked by, wheels marking slow time upon the stone. For women, in upper rooms candles were lit, flame bent beneath unseen draught, wax pooled soft in shallow arcs. For merchants, Henri's hand paused, a breath drawn deep. The quill rested upon the inkwell's edge. He rose once more, moving to the door. There, upon the threshold, he stood. The city's voice reached him in layered hush, river, stone, and unseen breath. A folded note pressed within his palm, cool against warm skin. And beneath the nave a forgotten light flickered alone. Evening fell slow upon the stones of Paris. The last pale light drained from the sky. Towers stood dark against a deepening blue. Across the city shutters drew closed with soft groan of wood and iron. The river whispered in steady breath beneath its bridges. Lanterns flared along the quay, each flame trembling in the cool air. For merchants, doors were barred. Scales and ledgers rested beneath folded cloth. For scribes, quills were set aside. Ink cooled beneath thin skins of oil. The hush of vellum held fast. And for soldiers, the night belonged to watch and steel. Along the ramparts of the Porte Saint-Honoré, the guard stood ready. Boots rang faint upon stone. Helms caught the glimmer of torchlight. Among them, Arnaud paced with measured step. His gaze traced the dark line of the road beyond the wall, empty now but for the slow drift of mist rising from the earth. Breath moved deep beneath the weight of mail and cloth. For peasants, hearths glowed low, shadows leaned long across worn floors, voices dropped to hush. For soldiers, the call of the hour passed soft from mouth to mouth. Arnaud shifted his grip upon the spear. The haft pressed cool beneath calloused fingers. Steel gleamed faint at its edge. He turned once to the brazier, drawing slow warmth from the thin flame. Sparks rose in brief arc, gold against the dark. For women, in narrow rooms, cloth was folded beneath tired hands. A final stitch, a drawn breath. For soldiers, the gate's great wheel creaked faint beneath steady pull. Chains stirred within the wall, voice of iron and shadow. Arnaud's eyes narrowed. A lone figure approached beneath the arch, cloak drawn close, step measured. The guard tensed. Steel shifted soft in practiced hands. The figure raised a token. A word passed beneath breath. Relief eased taut limbs. The gate remained closed. For scribes, beneath dim arches a lamp burned low. Shadows danced upon the worn page. Breath stirred dust from the stone. For soldiers, the night pressed on. Arnaud paced once more along the wall. Above, stars flickered faint through cloud-swept sky. Beneath, the city slept in layered hush, stone, water, breath. A folded scrap of linen pressed within his pouch. A token given at parting, words whispered beneath the day's last light. His fingers brushed it now, slow and steady. For peasants, beyond the gate, fields lay silver with dew. A lone owl called from the dark. For soldiers, torches were checked, blades drawn fresh from scabbard. The watch would hold through the long hours, step, breath, shadow. For Arnaud, time thinned. The torch beside him flared sudden beneath a shift of wind, its light bent sharp across stone. Breath moved deep, gaze traced the silent road once more. Above, the bell of Saint-Eustache tolled low, each note folded deep into the night. Arnaud stood beneath its echo, hand firm upon the spear, and through the unseen cracks, salt whispered faintly still. Night pressed thick upon the stones of Paris. The air lay cool now, drawn from the river and shadowed streets. Above, stars drifted faint through a veil of slow cloud. The towers of Notre Dame stood silent, their outlines softened by the dark. The city breathed slow. Footsteps thinned, voices dropped to low murmur. Shutters closed beneath tired hands. Iron locks turned with hollow ring. The river whispered beneath its bridges, dark and wide. Lanterns swayed along the quays, their glow reflected thin upon water stirred by unseen current. For merchants, ledgers rested beneath folded cloth. The day's last coin slipped quiet into waiting chests. For soldiers, steel gleamed in narrow guardrooms. Spears leaned against cool stone, boots scraped softly in restless pacing. And for scribes, the hour belonged to parchment and flame. In a narrow chamber beneath the cloisters of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Guillaume bent over his work. A single lamp burned upon the wide oak table, its light drawn thin across vellum and ink. Around him, the hush of stone pressed close. The high vault above faded into shadow, pale arcs of light caught in the shallow curves of ancient beams. Guillaume's quill moved in slow rhythm. Ink flowed thick and dark, each letter drawn with steady breath. For peasants, beyond the city wall, fields slept beneath a skin of pale dew. Hearth smoke drifted in thin threads toward the sky. For scribes, the library's air held scent of parchment and old wax. Stacks of scrolls leaned in uneven towers. Bindings lay cracked and worn by countless hands. Guillaume paused, lifting the quill. Fingers flexed slow, marked with faint ink and toil. He reached for a cloth, wiping the blade clean in practiced motion. A folded letter lay nearby, edges frayed, seal pressed deep with faded wax. His gaze lingered upon it, breath caught beneath ribs. For women, in cool chambers, linen was smoothed across narrow beds. Fingers folded worn cloth with care. Candlelight wavered beneath breath. For Guillaume, the words upon the page blurred beneath tired eyes. He leaned back, breath drawn slow. Above, the lamp's flame bent beneath unseen current, its glow trembling upon pale walls. From the alcove beyond, a faint rustle stirred, parchment brushed by unseen hand or breeze. He turned, gaze drawn to the sound. Nothing moved but the shadows. For soldiers, upon the ramparts, torches flared against stone. Steel rang faint as shifts were called. Eyes narrowed beneath weathered helms. For scribes, Guillaume turned once more to his task. Quill to ink, ink to page, stroke by careful stroke. Time thinned within the hush. The pulse of the city faded beneath the weight of stone and breath. A single droplet of wax traced the curve of the iron sconce, falling slow to rest upon worn table. For merchants, coins slept beneath seal and cloth. A lone figure paced beneath barred shutters. The hush of counting marked slow time. For Guillaume, the last line took form. Each letter pressed into being with reverence, with care. His breath moved deep, fingers steady. Beneath the folded letter he slipped the fresh page, a quiet offering to unseen hands. He leaned back, gaze tracing the faint curl of smoke rising from the lamp. The hush pressed close once more. Beyond the chamber door, the cloister lay wrapped in shadow. Arches breathed cool upon stone. Faint footfalls marked the farthest edge of hearing. Guillaume closed the inkwell with gentle hand. The quill rested beside it, its tip dark with the weight of the hour. He rose, drawing the letter to his breast. Steps slow, measured beneath the arch. Through narrow halls and worn flagstone, the scribe moved beneath the breath of ancient walls. And in the hollow dark, the breath of stone grew stronger. The small hours of night unfolded across the stones of Paris. Above the sleeping city, the sky deepened to velvet black. Stars shimmered faint behind thin cloud. The breath of the river moved slow beneath the dark arches of stone. The streets lay near silent, footsteps few, voices softer still. Lanterns burned in narrow pools of gold, their edges blurred by the press of damp air. The walls of Notre Dame rose vast and still, their shadows falling long across the empty square. For merchants, ledgers sealed beneath cold lock, shutters drawn, bolts fast against the dark. For soldiers, the night watch paced in slow rhythm. Steel sang low against worn leather, eyes flicked beneath battered helms. And for pilgrims, the hour called them forth. In the dim hush of Rue des Chantres, Colette walked beneath the gaze of the stone towers. Her cloak hung heavy with dew, her breath clouded faint in the cool air. Each step marked the worn cobbles in quiet cadence, one, then another. Across her shoulder, a bundle rested, linen, bread, a folded scrap of ribbon drawn from an old life. For scribes, quills lay dry upon pale parchment. The faint scent of oil and dust held the breath of stone within the vaults. For Colette, the road led through silence. She passed beneath a low arch where shadows clung thick to stone. The sound of water reached her ear, steady, soft, the pulse of the river drawn close. At the bridge she paused, hands pressed to cold stone, gaze drawn to the dark ribbon below. Boats drifted in shadow, their lanterns flickering across the water's slow face. A breath held, then released. For peasants. Within narrow yards, cattle shifted in their stalls. The sharp scent of hay and earth rose beneath the hush. For pilgrims. Colette crossed the span in measured step. Her gaze followed the path of the stars reflected faint upon the river's skin. Beneath the arch, a figure knelt in prayer, words unspoken, eyes closed beneath the weight of stone. She moved past, staff striking soft against the worn flags. For soldiers, torches flared upon the gate, voices low exchanged the hours, chain links rattled faint beneath unseen hands. For Colette, the cloister lay ahead. She traced its path through winding lanes, the breath of the city folding close. Beyond shuttered windows, the hush of sleeping breath marked the deeper hours of night. A folded letter rested within her bundle, its edges worn, words traced countless times beneath trembling fingers. For scribes, a lone lamp burned within the abbey's high vaults. Shadows drifted upon the walls, flickering in breath of unseen currents. For pilgrims, Colette reached the narrow gate. Iron cold beneath her touch, the latch lifted with faint sound. She passed through, breath caught beneath the hush of cloistered stone. Beneath the arch, benches lay worn and empty. A single candle burned beside the altar, its light bent low beneath the weight of air. She knelt upon cool flagstone, bundle set beside her. Hands folded, eyes closed, breath slowed. Time thinned beneath the hush, stone, skin, and shadow woven in the still air. For women, beyond high windows, linen stirred in soft draft. The scent of lavender folded into the hush. For pilgrims, Colette's gaze lifted once more. She drew forth the folded letter, tracing its edge with slow fingers. At the foot of the altar she placed it, a silent offering to unseen hands. And through forgotten corridors, soft footsteps echoed. The city held its breath beneath the weight of night. Paris lay hushed, its narrow streets veiled in mist drawn from river and stone. The towers of the great cathedral rose pale against the black sky, their outlines blurred by drifting cloud. Lanterns guttered in the damp air. The light of the moon barely touched the worn edges of the stones. Each step fell softer here. Each breath seemed drawn from the deep well of the earth. For merchants, locks clicked home. Shutters leaned shut with a final thud. Counters were cleared of coin and measure. For soldiers, the watch circled its path along high walls. Torches flickered against mail and steel. Hands rested upon spear shafts worn smooth by countless hours. And for women, the hours passed in quiet ritual. In a small room beneath the eaves of a stone house near Rue du Temple, Isolde moved through the hush. A basin of cool water rested upon the narrow sill. Her fingers brushed its rim, breath slow beneath the dim glow of a single candle. The day's labor weighed upon her shoulders, cloth scrubbed to bone upon stone, bread kneaded until arms burned. Now, within this shallow hour of night, her breath moved in slower rhythm. Each motion held the measure of the hour. For scribes, within cloistered halls, vellum dried beneath the flicker of lamp. Ink darkened upon the last line, the quill set aside in patient reverence. For Isolde, the basin's surface trembled faint beneath her touch. She cupped the water in her palms, lifting it to brow and cheek. Drops traced slow paths along her skin, cool threads of silence and release. From beneath the low bed she drew a folded cloth, threads pulled thin by years of wear. Within its folds a letter, edges curled, words faint but held still. For peasants. Beyond the gate, carts lay in silent rows, wheels tilted to earth, oxen stilled beneath dark sky. For women, the hush deepened. Isolde lit a second candle, its flame rising with soft sputter. The light pooled across rough boards, catching upon the worn grain. She unfolded the cloth with care, fingers lingering upon each crease. The letter within bore the marks of many readings. Ink faded, but words traced in memory's breath. Breath held. She read once more, eyes tracing the lines slow as prayer. For soldiers. Beneath the southern rampart, eyes marked the road beyond. Steel glinted faint beneath cloak and cowl. The hour stretched in measured silence. For Isolde, a tear traced the letter's edge, caught upon the worn fiber. She pressed the cloth to her chest, breath drawn deep beneath the press of stone and shadow. The candle's light wavered. Across the small table, herbs hung dry upon a thin twine. Their scent rose sharp in the still air, lavender, thyme, the faint trace of rue. For scribes, beneath high arches, a lone scholar traced fingers along the spine of a closed tome. Breath moved slow within the dark. For women, Isolde folded the cloth once more. She bound it with simple thread, hands steady despite the tremble of heart and limb. A step to the window. Beyond, the street lay empty. Mist rose in slender coils. The stones beneath gleamed wet beneath thin starlight. She placed the bundle upon the sill, a breath given to the hush, eyes closed, and beneath worn velvet the keys sang faintly once more. The hour before dawn held the deepest hush. Paris lay wrapped in shadow. The breath of the city rose slow from stone and river, mingling with the faint curl of mist along its narrow streets. The towers stood dark against a velvet sky, their shapes blurred by the veil of cloud and time. No bell marked this hour. No footfall stirred the heavy air. Beneath high arches and worn lintels, windows stood shuttered, lamps long cold. The river moved slow in its bed, dark, unbroken, a voice beneath the sleeping stone. For merchants, chests sealed beneath lock and key, cloth folded in waiting, coin counted beneath pale fingers. For scribes, ink dried upon the last word. Fingers traced the edge of vellum, the quill laid to rest. And for peasants, the hour called them forth. Beyond the northern gate, where stone gave way to earth and field, the first stirrings of life moved beneath the mist. Etienne rose from his narrow cot. The floor beneath his feet breathed cold through worn boards. In the dim light of a single tallow candle he dressed, linen rough against skin, wool drawn close against the chill. Beside the hearth a clay jug of water waited. He drank in slow rhythm, each swallow marked by the faint crackle of settling embers. For women, within darkened rooms, hands smoothed linen across weary shoulders, hair bound beneath kerchiefs, breath caught beneath the hush. For Etienne, the day began in measured silence. He crossed to the low table where a bundle of tools lay wrapped in cloth. Fingers traced their edges, wood smooth, steel cold. A folded scrap of parchment rested beneath the bundle. His wife's hand, a line of words drawn swift the night before. His gaze lingered upon it. For soldiers. Along the ramparts the watch changed in quiet ceremony. Steel rang faint against stone, the hour marked in muted voice. For peasants. Etienne moved through the low door, breath clouding in the cold. The yard lay shrouded in mist. Cart and oxen waited beneath the lean-to. Frost traced thin lines across wheel and yoke. He moved to the oxen, breath steady, voice low. Leather and iron drawn taut, rough hands moving in practiced ease. The road stretched dark beneath his wheels. Ruts filled with shallow pools caught the first pale light. For scribes, beneath the abbey's vaults a lone lamp burned. Fingers traced faded script, the hush of stone folded close. For peasants, the cart rolled beneath the city's gate. Guards marked its passage in silent nod. Beyond, the fields awaited. Rows of stubble traced with frost, earth hard beneath the tread. Etienne worked with steady hands, blade drawn sharp against stubborn stalk, breath misting beneath the rising light. Each motion traced the rhythm of countless days, cut, gather, bind. The sun rose slow behind a veil of cloud, pale and thin. For merchants, locks turned upon old doors, a single lantern lit, breath drawn deep before the hour. For peasants, the field held its hush. Etienne straightened, gaze drawn to the sky. A hawk circled high above, wings spread wide against the brightening gray. From beneath his tunic he drew a folded cloth, his wife's token, bound in simple twine. Fingers traced its edge. The wind stirred faint through the stubble. A single stalk bent beneath its breath, and beneath the nave a forgotten light flickered alone. Dawn crept slow through the stone veins of Paris. The city stirred beneath a sky of muted gold. High above, the towers of Notre Dame caught the first pale gleam, their spires sharp against the thinning dark. Mist rose in thin tendrils from the river, curling beneath the bridges, winding through narrow lanes. The stones beneath lay cold with dew. Footsteps rang soft against the wet. Shutters opened in cautious rhythm. Thin faces peered into the light, breath fogging against glass and wood. For soldiers, blades strapped beneath heavy cloaks. Eyes swept empty streets. Boots rang in measured stride. For scribes, pages turned beneath pale fingers. The first words of the day drawn slow upon worn vellum. And for merchants, the hour beckoned with quiet insistence. In a shop along the Rue des Lombards, Mathieu stood before the tall counter. The lock turned beneath his hand, iron cold, worn smooth by habit and time. Wood groaned faint as the door swung wide. The street beyond lay hushed. Mist clung to corners and awnings, softening the hard edges of stone and iron. For peasants, carts creaked along the river road. Wheels carved pale tracks through damp earth. Oxen lowed beneath rough yoke. For merchants, Mathieu lit the tall lamp beside the scales. Its flame wavered in the cool air, glow caught upon brass and wood. He moved through the shop in practiced rhythm. Dust brushed from ledgers, cloth smoothed across counters. Bolts of linen stood in quiet ranks. Jars of spice gleamed beneath thin glass. A folded letter waited upon the scale, its edges curled, the seal worn faint beneath the press of many hands. For soldiers, the gate stood open to the road beyond. Cloaks pulled close against the dawn's chill, words exchanged in low voice. For merchants, Mathieu's gaze lingered upon the letter. He traced its edge with steady fingers, breath drawn deep. Outside, the first voice called, sharp against the hush. A boy with baskets passed, feet bare upon the wet stone. The shop door remained ajar, the mist curling faint within. For scribes, beneath cloistered vaults, ink caught the rising light. Words formed beneath careful hand, silence folded deep into stone. For merchants, the first customer entered. An older man, cloak drawn tight, coins clutched within pale hand. Mathieu greeted him with nod and quiet word. Cloth measured in slow sweep, weight marked upon the ancient scale. Coin rang soft upon the counter. The man's gaze flicked toward the letter, then away. The transaction passed in near silence, fingers steady, breath even. For peasants, smoke rose thin from chimneys, bread set to bake, water drawn from well. For merchants, the shop emptied once more. Mathieu returned to the letter. He broke the seal with slow care, unfolding the worn page. The script within swam beneath tired eyes, news from a distant port, goods delayed beneath storm and tide. Breath caught faint beneath ribs. The lamp's flame bent beneath unseen current. Wax pooled slow upon the base. For women, beneath cool eaves, herbs hung in fading light. Fingers traced each stem, breath drawn deep. For merchants, the letter folded once more. Mathieu slipped it beneath the ledger, hands moving with deliberate grace. He crossed to the window, gaze drawn to the waking street. Mist drifted soft across the stones. Shadows gathered beneath empty carts. A single cart creaked slow past, wheel groaning beneath the weight. Mathieu stood within the hush, breath steady. And through the unseen cracks, salt whispered faintly still. The pale hours of morning stretched across Paris. The mist clung stubborn along the river's curve, veiling stone and water alike. Above, the towers of the Hôtel de Ville faded into shifting cloud, their outlines drawn in trembling light. Shutters swung open with slow hands. The air remained cool, damp with the breath of the river and the pressed hush of dawn. For merchants, scales tipped beneath the first weight of the day. Fingers traced worn coin, ledgers opened to fresh line. For scribes, quills dipped in still ink. The first strokes pressed soft upon the page. And for soldiers, the watch turned beneath the rising light. Upon the ramparts of the Grand Châtelet, Pierre adjusted the strap of his mail. Leather creaked beneath calloused fingers. Steel shifted with low ring against cloth. His breath rose in slow rhythm, drawn deep through the chill. The city below stirred faint, voices thin, carts few upon the damp stone. For peasants, water drawn from deep wells. Buckets rose with hollow groan, oxen yoked beneath rough command. For soldiers, the hour called for steady gaze. Pierre paced along the worn path of stone. Each bootstep marked the flag with muffled tone, one, then another. Mist rose in slow curls beyond the wall. The road beyond lay empty, save for the pale trail of a lone cart. He paused beneath the northern turret. Fingers traced the shaft of his spear, wood smooth with years of use. For women, cloth drawn tight across shoulder and arm, baskets filled with bread and herb beneath thin sky. For Pierre, the rhythm of watch moved slow. Eyes scanned the road once more. Breath caught beneath the chill, released in faint cloud. A folded scrap of linen pressed within his pouch. His wife's token stitched with careful hand. Each touch to its edge steadied his heart. For scribes, beneath cloistered vault, candles trimmed, ink stirred to life beneath measured breath. For soldiers, the shift neared its end. Pierre's gaze lifted to the spires beyond the river. Their tips pierced the thinning cloud, silent sentinels above the waking stone. He moved once more along the path, each step marked by habit, by the press of hours spent within the city's breath. Below, the market square filled with slow motion. Voices rose beneath the hush. Wheels marked the stone with hollow sound. For merchants, cloth unfurled beneath practiced hand, spice drawn in measured spoon, glass caught the trembling light. For soldiers, Pierre paused at the gate. A lone figure approached from the outer road, cloak drawn close, step steady, eyes narrowed, spear shifted with soft whisper. The figure raised a hand, words passed low in familiar voice. The guard relaxed, breath easing. Pierre lowered his spear, shoulders settling beneath the weight of mail. For women? Water simmered above low flame. Fingers traced the rim of battered pot. Breath caught in the steam. For soldiers, the mist began to lift. Stone gleamed wet beneath fresh light. Flags stirred upon the breeze, edges frayed, colors muted by years and air. Pierre leaned against the cold stone, gaze drawn to the shifting sky. A single hawk circled high above, its cry lost to the breath of the city. He drew the linen token from his pouch, fingers resting upon its worn thread. Breath moved slow. The gate stood firm beneath his watch, the hour held in layered hush. And beneath worn velvet, the keys sang faintly once more. Morning pressed thin and silver across Paris. Mist lingered along the river's edge, folding soft against stone and timber. The bells of Saint-Jacques rang the hour, each tone drawn slow through damp air. The streets awoke beneath muted light. Carts creaked beneath fresh load. Shutters swung open with groan of iron and wood. The towers stood veiled, their spires sharp against a pale sky. For merchants, cloth was unfurled. Coin shifted beneath steady hand, scales tipped with the first weights of the day. For soldiers, spears checked and steel drawn bright. The watch resumed its slow path along the walls. And for scribes, the breath of the library moved with the hour. Within the cool heart of the abbey, beneath arches worn smooth by time, Laurent bent above a wide oak table. Vellum spread beneath his fingers, the script half-formed beneath the press of ink and breath. Light filtered thin through narrow panes. Dust swirled in slow dance upon each shaft, gold motes caught in the deep hush. For peasants, fields drank the first light. Blades swung in practiced rhythm, the earth yielded beneath rough hands. For scribes, Laurent drew breath. The quill touched ink once more, tip black and gleaming. With measured hand, he traced the next line. Each letter rose beneath his will, arc, stem, curve. Around him, the library whispered. Pages turned in distant alcove. Footfalls echoed soft upon worn stone. For women, herbs gathered beneath thin sun. Fingers bound them in slender sheaves. Breath caught faint upon the green. For Laurent, the rhythm held. Stroke, pause, breath. His eyes followed the path of each line, mind tuned to the cadence of ink and thought. Beside him, a folded letter waited. Edges crisp, seal unbroken. Its weight called beneath each breath. For soldiers, the first change of the day rang beneath the gate. Mail gleamed sharp. Voices murmured beneath banners, stilled by the hush. For scribes, a shadow passed beneath the high window. Laurent lifted his gaze. The library stood vast and empty, save for the slow drift of light. The scent of wax and vellum folded close around him. He reached for the letter. Fingers traced the seal, smooth beneath his touch. A pause, breath drawn deep. For peasants, water splashed against stone. Buckets swung in steady hands. Oxen lowed beneath the rising sun. For scribes, the seal gave with faint crack. Laurent unfolded the page, eyes tracing the familiar hand. Lines of distant voice rose beneath his gaze, news of storm and delay, of words long sought. The lamp beside him flickered. Wax pooled in slow spiral upon the dish, its edges trembling in unseen draught. For women, loaves baked beneath careful eye, cloth draped warm across the waiting board. For Laurent, the letter closed beneath resting palm. He turned once more to the page. The quill moved in soft stroke, words drawn with reverence and care. Beyond the window, the mist began to lift. The towers of the city rose sharp once more against the sky. Time stretched thin within the hush, stone and breath and ink woven in slow dance, and through forgotten corridors, soft footsteps echoed. The light of late morning unfolded slow across Paris. Mist lifted from the river's skin, leaving pale trails against stone and timber. The bridges gleamed damp beneath the sun's first warmth. The city breathed deeper beneath thinning cloud. Voices grew in narrow streets. Vendors called in low rhythm. Carts rattled slow beneath laden wheels. Yet within certain spaces the hush remained. For merchants, bolts of cloth laid bare. Fingers traced their edges, scales tipped with silver weight. For soldiers, mail caught in sharp sun. The sound of steel rang hollow beneath vaulted gate. And for pilgrims, the road wound still beneath worn feet. Jean passed beneath the tall arch of Rue Saint-Jacques, staff striking soft against stone. His cloak hung faded against weary frame. Eyes shadowed by miles walked in thought and prayer. The crowd thinned where the road curved near the river. There, silence pressed close, drawn from water and unseen breath. For scribes, beneath cool vaults, ink darkened upon page. Words formed in careful hand, dust stirred beneath faint draught. For Jean, the path led toward the great square. The towers of Notre Dame rose vast ahead, their stones sharp in new light. Breath moved slow between parted lips. He paused upon the threshold of the square. The stones beneath his feet bore the mark of countless pilgrims, each worn smooth by the weight of hope and penance. For women, linen drawn fresh upon sill. The scent of rose and sage drifted light beneath the sun. For pilgrims, Jean crossed the square in measured step. Staff held firm, gaze lifted toward the darkened doors. At their foot he knelt, cloth drawn close beneath thin knees. The stones cold, worn beneath his touch. Breath stilled, hands folded, fingers trembling faint. Around him, the city moved in distant hum, voices muted beneath the stone hush of sacred space. For merchants, ledgers opened with patient hand, the first figures of the day drawn slow in ink. For Jean, a folded scrap of parchment rested within his pouch. He drew it forth with reverence, edges worn, words traced countless times beneath candle's breath. Eyes closed. Each word within read once more in silent voice. The wind stirred faint across the square. A curl of dust traced thin arc before the doors. For soldiers, the watch shifted stance, blades set firm, helms gleamed beneath steady gaze. For pilgrims, Jean rose with care. He placed the folded page at the base of the great door, an offering of voice and silence alike. Breath caught deep within the hush. The towers rose above, vast and unyielding, yet within their shadow the faint tremble of hope stirred anew. For scribes, beneath cloistered stone, the last line dried beneath the scholar's hand. A single candle flickered faint against worn glass. For Jean, the square lay wide once more. He turned beneath the weight of the moment, feet light upon the worn stone. Beyond, the narrow lanes called, each turn marked by shadow and light. He passed beneath an arch where ivy clung deep within the stone. Fingers brushed the rough edge, breath drawn slow, and across the cold beams, shadows gathered in silence. The sun stood higher now, its warmth folding through the stone veins of Paris. Mist had burned from the river's edge. The bridges gleamed beneath a pale sky. Shadows shortened, drawn tight beneath eaves and lintels. The city pulsed beneath the hour. Voices swelled in the streets, layers of sound woven with the breath of stone and wood. For merchants, goods laid upon stall and bench, spice lifted upon the air, linen caught light in narrow arcs. For soldiers, the watch held steady. Steel rang faint beneath shifting foot, eyes swept beneath banner and spire. And for women, the hour called them to still quieter labor. In a small room above Rue de la Verrerie, Aveline moved through the hush. The window stood open to the thin light. Curtains swayed soft against the breath of wind drawn from the river. Upon the table a basket of herbs waited, sage, lavender, rosemary bound in slender sheaves. For scribes, beneath vaulted beam, vellum turned beneath pale hand. Quill scratched slow, the hour held deep within ink and breath. For Aveline, fingers traced each stem. The scent rose sharp beneath her breath, folding with the light upon worn wood. A folded cloth rested near, edges pressed smooth by careful hand. Within it, a letter not yet sent, words held in the pause between thought and ink. She moved to the basin by the sill. Water stirred beneath her touch, cool and dark. A single droplet traced her wrist, falling silent upon the stone. For peasants, beneath the sunlit field, sickles swung in wide arc. Grain whispered in slow fall, sweat traced the curve of spine. For women, Aveline gathered the herbs in twine, fingers sure despite the tremble beneath bone. Breath moved deep. The light shifted faint across the floor, shadows sliding in slow dance. She turned to the letter once more. For soldiers, beneath the southern gate, banners stirred beneath unseen current. Voices low passed beneath helm and mail. For Aveline, the quill lifted. Ink touched pale page. Each word drawn in slow thread, thought and breath woven beneath the hush. Beyond the open window, a child's laughter rang sudden and clear, sharp thread in the tapestry of morning sound. Aveline's gaze lifted, eyes drawn to the street below. A boy ran past, hair bright beneath the sun, his voice trailed in fading echo. She turned back to her task. For scribes, beneath cloistered walk, the last scroll pressed beneath seal. A lone figure moved in slow measure through shadowed stone. For women, the letter lay near complete. Ink pooled in faint arc at the page's edge. Her breath stilled upon the last line. Aveline reached for the folded cloth. She wrapped the letter in slow care, fingers tracing each fold as though sealing thought to flesh. Outside, bells rang faint upon the air, notes drawn thin across the stone. For merchants, coin rang sharp upon the stall. Cloth measured in wide sweep, scales tipped beneath careful eye. For Aveline, the bundle pressed beneath her palm. She rose, breath caught deep. To the window she stepped once more. The street lay bright now. The breath of the city rose rich upon the air. She placed the bundle upon the sill, gaze lingering upon its worn thread. And beneath the nave a forgotten light flickered alone. The sun passed its high arc above Paris. Shadows shortened beneath worn stone. Light poured slow across lintels and beam. The breath of the city deepened, warm and layered with dust, spice, and distant forge. The river moved smooth beneath its bridges. Flecks of light traced its dark skin, each ripple folding beneath arch and quay. The streets pulsed with sound, voices thick in narrow space, footsteps lost beneath wheel and hoof. For merchants, linen stretched across rough counter, spices weighed in trembling scale, gold caught sun in flicker and gleam. For soldiers, mail gleamed beneath banner's edge. The ring of blade upon shield marked slow time, and for peasants, the fields called beneath the weight of day. Beyond the Port Saint-Denis, where the city's stone gave way to earth, Julien bent to the row. His hands moved through rich soil, fingers tracing the green life beneath. The sun warmed his back, sweat traced the hollow of his neck. Around him the field breathed slow. Blades swung in careful arc, grain whispered beneath their fall. For scribes, beneath cloister's hush, quills moved in patient rhythm. Ink rose upon page in layered dance. For peasants, breath held deep. Julien straightened, gaze sweeping the wide line of field and sky. The towers of the city stood faint in the haze, sharp lines softened by distance and air. Beside him a basket rested upon worn cloth, simple fare wrapped in linen, folded with care. A scrap of paper lay beneath its edge, a note pressed in hurried hand that morning. For women, cloth drawn wide to catch the light. Thread moved beneath slender fingers, breath caught beneath each pass. For peasants, the work moved with the sun. Julien bent once more, blade in hand, grain to earth, each stroke a measure of time beneath the sky's vast breath. Around him the earth whispered, root and stone, leaf and stem. The city a faint hum beyond the edge of green. For soldiers, beneath the arching gate the watch changed hands, blades sheathed in single motion, eyes held in long gaze. For peasants, Julien paused. Water drawn from cool jar, lifted slow to lips. A single bead traced the curve of jaw, falling silent to earth. Breath moved deep beneath cloth and skin. For scribes, beneath high vault, scroll sealed beneath wax. A lone figure moved through pale shaft of light. For peasants, the field held its hush. Julien rose, wiping soil from palm. Fingers traced the worn handle of blade, breath measured. The sun dipped faint toward afternoon. He reached for the folded scrap beneath the basket's edge. Eyes traced the line once more. Simple words, drawn in soft curve of hand. A single smile beneath the hush of field and stone. For merchants, coin counted beneath shaded arch. Cloth bound in thick twine, breath caught beneath the hum of trade. For peasants, Julien gathered the day's work in measured hands, grain bound tight, arms full beneath the sky's gaze. He turned toward the distant path, boots pressing faint mark upon dry earth. Ahead the city waited, stone and breath, life woven in shadow and light, and through the unseen cracks, salt whispered faintly still.